Now, I'd like to read 3 short excerpts from the Miracle Mile. The first is on you guys, the rowing crew. It's probably my favorite part of the book. It's just an amazing Cinderella story of the UBC Vancouver Rowing Club crew that pulled off one of the biggest upsets in Commonwealth Games history. Rowing out on the Vetter Canal, out where I come from, out in Chilliwack and Abbotsford, of all places. So just to give a little bit of background for where this excerpt starts, the UBC boys had a pretty nervous start to their race, as you're gonna read. They lost their rhythm almost immediately, and several crew members caught what's known in rowing as a crab. It means that their oars failed to clear the surface of the water. But somehow they kept their heads, and they restarted rowing in unison, and we're going to pick it up from there. I'm just going to grab my book here. The race should have been over right there. The experienced English should have sped off, pulling away from the valiant Canadians rowing out the string, and trying not to look like complete fools, just as that speculative Chilliwack Progress article had predicted. But then something remarkable happened. The UBC boys didn't pack it in. Maybe the man with the big black whip and the countless miles logged out on Cole Harbour had hardened them so they could not buckle. Right about then, the Victor Spencer rowing shell began to fly as it never had in training. "Go into 38, yelled Ray Serpina, sitting in the boat's stern and crowing out the stroke rhythm like an enraged rooster. His arms flapped in a wide arc, slapping the shell's side so hard reverberations were felt down its entire length. Their jitters faded into the brisk rhythm, each rower focusing on putting everything he had into the stroke at hand. At 100 meters, the English were no longer pulling ahead, but the Canadians weren't gaining any ground either. "Go into 40, Big 10, Big 10, yelled Serpina, the tin megaphone strapped to his head vibrating like a tuning fork. "No mistakes now, boys. Let's catch those limeys." It may have been the earliest call for a Big 10 push ever in a race, but desperate times call for desperate measures. They had to make up ground, now. The English continued to plod along at a 36 beat rate, and by the 250-meter mark, the Canadians had nearly caught them. By 400 meters, they had pulled a meter into the lead. There would be a race today, after all. The spooked English now chose to fight fire and up their rate to 40 to match the Canadians. At the 500-meter mark, both teams were virtually even, the lead swinging back and forth as each shell's bow nosed ahead. But here the superior fitness of Frank Reed's boys began to turn the tide. Somehow they maintained their 40-stroke pace, even upping it occasionally to 42 or a sapping 44, while the English faltered ever so slightly. At the halfway mark, the Canadians had edged ahead by half a boat length, and the 10,000 spectators on the Vetter's banks rose to their feet and began to roar as the boats came closer. Cries of "Come on, Canada!" drowned out the loudspeaker. They say that in an eights race, most victories are won in the first 500 meters or lost in the third 500. In this case, Reed's boys had miraculously fought back to give themselves a chance in the first quarter. But the English failed to step up from 10,000 meters on, or from 1,000 meters on. Maybe they just could not believe a bunch of green kids could maintain this grinding effort and must inevitably tire. Whatever the reason, the English shifted back to a steady 36 beat, wanting none of the brute tempo of this wicked game, while the Canadians continued to plow ahead at 40. They were undoubtedly tiring. Their oars entered the water less smoothly, and sloppy splashes were common. At times they looked jerky and raw, and maybe their inexperience showed more now than at any other point. But they also painted a picture of blunt, thrusting speed at its most unrefined, something the English had no answer for. By the three-quarter mark, the Canadians had built a full two-length lead, but every stroke felt like murder. Their shoulders ached, their thighs burned. Every breath seared the lungs. Glenn Smith and Serpina allowed no relief. Reed had instructed them to take it out hard, and they had. So now their cocks and strokes simply didn't allow them to take it down. But they didn't have much left, and there was still a long way to go. And the English, finally sensing it was now or never, upped their rate once more. As they always did, the Canadians had chosen landmarks along the Vetter that matched up with familiar points on their training runs. They had placed the taconite marker at the end of the plank seating, which had worked fine when the seating was empty. But when 10,000 plus people overflowed past its farthest extent on race day, it made the marker nearly impossible to discern. Rather than risking leaving their final push too late, Serpina did the only sensible thing in the circumstances. As soon as the masses on the banks became thick enough, he began calling, "Taconite, taconite," and then another and another. Already exhausted, their stroke rate jumped to at least a frantic 44, maybe higher. A sustained sprint almost unheard of in rowing in that time. With tired arms, legs, and lungs, on they reached for muddy water and heaved again and again. Jung, 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 jung. The Spencer fairly flew those last few meters. The roar of the crowd seemed deafening, even drowning out Serpina. "Taconite, taconite, one last time. Don't let those limeys catch us now." There was no need to worry. The English were over 2 lengths in arrears. One final stroke and the Spencer sliced the line in a time of 6 minutes 59 seconds as an official on the dock fired a shotgun blast skyward. The English followed nearly 12 seconds behind. The Canadians slumped forward or fell back, exhausted but elated. Flashbulbs snapped as they slapped one another's backs and struggled to catch their breath. It was done. Canada's first gold medal in 8s rowing in any international games. Some called it the most unexpected victory of the 1954 Games. Others said it was the greatest upset in British Empire and Commonwealth Games history, and no one denied either claim. I'd like to read a short excerpt of the final half of the Miracle Mile race. So just to set the stage here a little, there's over 35,000 people in Empire Stadium to watch this race. It's been hyped and built up unlike any race in history, with media from all over the world covering it. It's being broadcast live across North America. The first time a sports event had been televised live from coast to coast. Hundreds of millions of people are tuning in on TV and radio. So you have Roger Bannister, the first man in history to run a mile in under 4 minutes, facing for the first time John Landy, the only other man who has run a sub 4-minute mile and now owns the world record. For the first 3 laps, the race pretty much went as expected. Landy led from the front and at one time had built a 15-yard lead, while Bannister chipped away at that lead from behind. But entering the final lap, they're only a couple yards apart, so we're going to pick it up from there. By now, the crowd was on its feet, screaming itself hoarse. They weren't just roaring for Roger Bannister and John Landy, but also for Rich Ferguson, the Canadian in third, running the race of his life. Everything else in the stadium stopped. Concession staff hurtled over their deserted counters and ran to the stadium entrances to watch the final lap. The Canadian men's 4x1 10-yard relay team, preparing outside the stadium, halted their warm-ups and sprinted inside. On the infield, competitors in the hammer throw, pole vault and broad jump stopped everything and turned to watch. New Zealand's Yvette Williams, on her way to winning 2 more gold medals that afternoon, stood at the broad jump pit, transfixed, hands covering her mouth as she held her breath. The crowd noise, a thunderous rolling crescendo, was deafening. Chris Chataway, virtually yelling over the noise into the CKWX microphone, exclaimed at one point, "The crowd are going absolutely mad here." To some degree, each of the 7 remaining milers had experienced large, loud crowds before, but this was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. The noise felt disorienting, confining, almost crushing. Young Murray Hallberg, now struggling in 5th place, recalled that the sensation was such of a noise, a crowd, the occasion, all combining to give the feeling of not being able to control the situation. It was like being tumbled and in danger of drowning in the heavy surf. The harder I tried to fight, the worse it got. Landy could no longer hear himself breathing, let alone hear Bannister's footsteps just behind him. Coming into the first corner of the final lap, his shadow stretched out in front of him. A quick inside turn of his head revealed Bannister's shadow a little farther back, but as he rounded the corner into the back straight, the shadows fell out of his line of view, and he no longer knew where Bannister was. He decided it was now or never, and quickened his stride, hoping to add to his leading cushion and lose Bannister for good. Bannister, feeling dangerously depleted, held on as Landy's lead grew again by a yard or 2, but Bannister remained determined. "I fixed myself to Landy like a shadow," he recalled. At the end of the backstretch, Landy could feel Bannister on his heels and knew he was in trouble. Bannister was too close and must be kicking soon. In the stands, the wild, thrashing banks of humanity were urging them both on. Entering the turn, Landy took another quick peek over his inside shoulder. "I was wondering, when is it going to come?" Bannister, too, was feeling the strain. I felt there was a dangerous moment on the backstretch when John made his move, he remembered. I knew I had to keep close without using my reserve energy. So he clung to Landy, steeling himself for the coming moment of truth when his mind would galvanize his body to the greatest effort it had ever known. I knew I was tired, he said. There might be no response, but it was my only chance. Around the turn at the 1,500-meter mark, Landy still led, running 3 minutes, 41.9 seconds, only 0.1 seconds slower than his world record, but he was barely hanging on now, and his once fluid stride had begun to tie up and slow marginally. Bannister, on the other hand, amid the frenzy howling from the stands, was somehow keeping his focus, and he finally made the decision to sprint with all that remained in him. Ross McWhirter, writing in Athletics World magazine, describes Bannister's move as being like a high-horsepower car building up the revs, and in he slammed the clutch. Never had Bannister left his finishing kick so late in the race. I chose the time when I thought he would least expect me, which was on the end of the last curve, he explained. By overtaking him there, I was actually running extra distance, but I thought that it would take him by surprise. Those spectators who were crowded just inches off the track received faces full of cinders flung off Bannister's spikes as he accelerated. The stands seemed to shake as the overpowering thunderclap of excitement drowned out everything else. And then came the defining moment of the race, the months of build-up, the whole 1954 games, perhaps even that era in all of sport anywhere. Bannister, gaining with each hurtling stride, surged past Landy on the outside. And at the same instant, Landy looked back again over his inside shoulder. He saw no sign of Bannister. It was a look of hope, Landy said later. Hope that his back straight burst had been enough. He turned back just as a blurring white figure streaked by on his right. Landy later claimed he looked back in an attempt to see the third-place runner, though in truth, he knew it was just a matter of time before Bannister passed him, and the shock on his face said it all. It was akin to a blow in the stomach, he said. Landy's head turn also fractionally delayed his reaction to Bannister's sprint. It was my tremendous luck that these two happenings, his turning around and my final sprint, came almost simultaneously, Bannister admitted in the 4-minute mile. Ferguson, clinging to third place halfway around the turn and about 40 yards behind, saw it all. The sun was coming from the rear across the inlet, and I'm sure John was looking for Roger's shadow, he said. But at that precise moment, Roger was at his shoulder, and the two shadows were one. Bannister was 90 yards from the finish when he charged past Landy, the Englishman's mouth agape, gasping for air, hair flapping in the wind. Landy, who was run out, had no response. The crowd, having wrung every last decibel out of their lungs over the past 60 seconds, now exploded in one massive detonation. The broadcast footage that has survived vibrates momentarily at this point. Amateur footage taken by excited spectators in the stands shakes crazily. In both, spectators can be seen wildly shouting and punching the air with triumphant fists. In living rooms and bars across the continent, millions watching on television jumped on their sofas, pushed their stools back, and yelled at the screen. Most announcers became just as caught up in the drama and lost all semblance of partiality. You could almost envision the CBC's Steve Douglas on his feet cheering wildly as he described the race's climactic moment. Bannister is kicking very definitely. He's passing Landy. Landy looked the wrong way. A few feet away in the press box, Chataway yelled above the din into his microphone, the genuine exhilaration over his friend's victory shining through. Roger Bannister has come into the lead. Roger Bannister is striding away. The most magnificent win. Roger Bannister has 5 yards on John Landy, 6 yards, 7 yards. The race is all over. Bannister crashed through the 2-ply baby wolf finish line string, his face turned up to the sky, exhaustion written on every strained line. Landy followed 5 yards behind, uncharacteristically looking as fresh as when he started 4 laps earlier. It marked his first mile defeat in 2 years. Now, if you want to see the full race in color, head back to the Week You'll Remember a Lifetime exhibit, and you can actually see the full CBC broadcast footage on display here. Finally, I'd like to read one last excerpt, and that's of an event that took place half an hour after the Miracle Mile, the finish of Jim Peters' marathon. So again, just to set the stage for this, August 7th, 1954 was probably the hottest day of that year. The temperature in Vancouver was a humid 28 degrees Celsius, but out on those exposed streets around Vancouver where the marathoners were running, it felt more like 38 degrees. The hills on this course were killer. I've walked the route myself, and I can see why over half the field failed to finish. Seasoned international runners were dropping like flies after just 8 or 10 miles. Now, Jim Peters was the fastest marathoner in history at that time and was the heavy favorite to win gold. He typically didn't drink water in races, and he didn't on this day as he ran from the front. He was suffering in the heat, but he'd built a 3-mile lead over the next closest runner when he approached Empire Stadium, and we'll pick it up there. As Jim Peters approached the stadium, he became vaguely aware of something wrong. "As I went up the hill, I wobbled a little," he wrote in the long run. But this was more than a wobble, as at least one witness saw him collide with a lamppost. Clearly, he was in some distress. After watching the mile, Jeff Warren had gone down to stand on the hill outside the stadium to encourage Peters on his way in, but he found the street eerily quiet. A lone volunteer waited at the northeast gate to indicate the way in. Then Warren saw Peters. As he came towards me, he recalled in a 2013 interview, he was already in a bother, still running, glassy-eyed, and didn't acknowledge my call. "Come on, Jim, come on. You're nearly there." He didn't seem to see me, even though we passed within only a few meters, veering from side to side. Peters' physical appearance gave Warren a chill. He looked like a concentration camp victim. His bones were sticking out, and his eyes and skull looked thin. It was a horror sight. Peters had reached the stadium in 2 hours, 23 minutes, near but not on the world record pace, as some sources incorrectly reported. Based on his training, he believed himself capable of running nearly 8 minutes faster in the 2-hour, 15-minute range under favorable conditions. Clearly, conditions were not favorable that day. As the gate swung open to admit him, the PA announcer intoned, "Jim Peters, about to enter the stadium. He's not in good shape." Several witnesses recall that the announcement almost sounded as if he had been cut off, but it may only have been that the announcer was in as much shock as everyone else. Peters wobbled a little at the top of the steep ramp down to the track, and he remembered feeling an unnerving giddiness, something he typically encountered when looking down from any height. The thought crossed his mind that he should wave to the crowd as he usually did entering a stadium at the end of a race, but he decided to take no chances and simply finish this murderous run off. He found his rhythm again and began awkwardly teetering toward the oval. And that's when everything seemed to stop. The entire stadium focusing on the pale little man dressed in all white in sharp, shocking contrast to the black asphalt on which he stood. Probably owing to his peculiar head bobbing, even more pronounced by his extreme fatigue, the crowd momentarily hesitated. Was he okay? Some mistakenly thought he was clowning around. "I thought he was putting on a show," said Mario Caravetta. Then, realizing Peters was fighting exhaustion, the crowd let loose a roar of encouragement, and he continued ambling down the slope with the eyes of 35,000 people upon him. And then Jim Peters fell. The crowd released a collective gasp, and a sudden hush blanketed the stands. That deathly silence, it was unreal, something I'd like to forget, but I'll never forget it, recalled Murray Hallberg. "I just couldn't understand what had happened," Peters said later, of his somersault near the foot of the ramp. "For a moment I was completely bewildered. Then I made up my mind I was going to finish." Shakily, he picked himself up, and the crowd applauded his courage. He must have stumbled over something on the ramp, right? But after a few more steps, Peters collapsed again. From that point on, he slipped in and out of consciousness. "I do remember coming into the stadium and falling for the first time on the sharp incline," he recalled. "I thought of 1908 and Durando Pietri and the very next race I was due to run at the European Championships in Bern. Up in the royal box, Lord Alexander must have been squirming uncomfortably. It had been just the previous day that he had told Peters of witnessing Pietri's collapse at the 1908 Olympics. Peters later recalled falling 3 times. In reality, it was closer to 12. although some claim it was as high as 20. Over the next 10 minutes, but again, estimates vary greatly, he managed to stumble and crawl just 200 yards of the track, when normally he would have pounded out 2 miles in the same amount of time. Everybody was mesmerized, remembered North Vancouver sports historian Len Corbin, then just a boy. When you're in a situation like that, time kind of stands still, almost like in a car accident. Watching Peters in this state was truly horrible, but most couldn't take their eyes off him. Many commented they felt they were witnessing the final stages of a man running himself to death before their eyes. And they were right. Peter's skin was a ghostly glazed white, with just the slightest hint of sickly yellow, which was magnified grotesquely by the glare of the bright beating sun. No longer running, he shuffled drunkenly, legs rubbery, arms swinging limply, everything uncoordinated, and a blank, emotionless stare upon his face. He looked as if he was in a trance, remembered Kevin Gosper. He tripped, twisted, fell on his back, picked himself up, then pitched face first to the cinders, badly cutting his lip. Then he picked himself up again. When he picked himself up again, it was clear he had lost all bodily coordination as he turned over on both ankles with each step. At one point, though there was a water fountain beckoning like an oasis just a few feet off the track, he crawled on his hands and knees and seemed to be calling out for help like a man lost in the parching desert. I thought I could see the tape, sort of like a mirage, he said in an interview with the Vancouver Sun days later. I thought I'd made it, but the tape didn't seem to be coming any nearer. At first, the crowd had roared each time he rose and collectively groaned when he fell. Peters vaguely recalled this. I could hear a noise, that's all, sort of a cheer. But soon the stadium fell into shocked silence, amazed something like this could be happening in front of him. Everyone wanted to do something to stop it, but no one seemed to have the wherewithal or authority to do so, and so it went on. Reactions of witnesses ran the gamut. Some wept, others turned away, unable to watch, and a few were visibly sick, including one reporter who vomited at trackside. For Bannister, just minutes after achieving victory in the greatest race of his life, the sight of Peters in this condition was horrifying. "Stop it, for heaven's sake," he called out. Many of the other milers, still down on the infield, saw things unfold firsthand too. It was horrible, like something out of the Colosseum, remembered Landy, and ironic that it should happen immediately after the mile. Hallberg remembered feeling sick. It was truly sad. And Bill Bailey remembered that we were almost in tears. I remember just holding my breath. It was unbelievable. But those with the ability to assist were waved away by officials who feared their intervention would disqualify Peters. Several doctors in attendance pleaded with them to remove Peters from the race before he further endangered his life. The English team officials heard the recommended action but refused to allow it. Ultimately, a most unlikely individual took matters into his own hands and ended this disaster before it became any worse. The English team's masseur, Mick Mays, an elderly, silver-haired man wearing a gleaming white lab coat, was standing at the west side finish line next to Bill Parnell. I said to him, "Mickey, somebody should end that," recollected Parnell. Mays said, "I'm going to." With those words, Mays pushed through the crowd, his ankle-length lab coat billowing out as he ran, and stepped onto the track just beyond the finish line. It made for one of the most dramatic sports photos ever taken. Mays stood there, arms outstretched, gently coaxing Peters in, a look of sincere compassion on his face that seemed to say, "Come now, son, your work today is done." Peters, seeing Mays' inviting arms, picked up his awkward pace and collapsed into him. His horrendous battle was over.
I think I speak on behalf of many of you who are able to relive those wonderful days in 1954. We've got to remember that Vancouver was a very different place at that time. Very few people in the world understood Vancouver, and we didn't understand the world. We were largely an Anglo-style peripheral country in the empire, and from that date forward, I think our destinies changed in Vancouver. And then, of course, that was cemented in 1986 with the Expo, and suddenly we have become a world destination of people from around the world, from cultures that we didn't understand in 1954 to those that we do now. And I think it was a very major turning point for Vancouver. And Jason has captured that era in an amazing fashion. I'm going to call Jason to say a few words and read from his book. Jason Beck.